Hey team, Brains here. I'm your math tutor, and today we're going to do the product rule and the quotient rule by the definition of derivative. So let's just jump right into it. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to write out what we're looking for. We want the derivative of a product of two functions f and g. Okay, now using our definition of derivative, that's going to be a limit as h approaches 0. Then we're going to have the functions plus h, so we've got f of x plus h times g of x plus h minus the functions minus f of x times g of x, and then all over h. Not bad? Okay. Next, we're going to subtract and add f of x times g of x plus h. So we're going to go limit as h approaches 0, f of x plus h times g of x plus h. Now we're going to subtract f of x times g of x plus h. We're going to add f of x times g of x plus h. And then we're going to have those final two in the back, f of x times g of x. And this whole thing is still all over h. Okay, not bad so far. Then we're going to group them up a little bit. We can take out a g of x plus h in the first group. So we're going to do that. We'll have the limit as h approaches 0. What do we have left when we take it out? We've got the f of x. I'm going to write it like this. F of x plus h. And then we've got the minus the other f of x. And then, since h is over everything, I can write it like this. Times g of x plus h. And we're going to add the other grouping. We're going to take out f of x. So let's take it out on the left. So we're going to take out f of x. And then that's multiplied by g of x plus h minus g of x all over h. Okay, now we can distribute the limit. We're going to have limit as h approaches 0 of the first function here. So this is our f of x plus h minus f of x all over h times the limit as h approaches 0 of g of x plus h, then plus the limit. Now, f of x doesn't depend on h, so we can bring it out. So we're going to just write f of x times the limit as h approaches 0 of g of x plus h minus g of x, then all this over h. Okay. Well, hold up a second. By definition, that right there is f prime of x. And this one, by definition, is g prime of x. Okay. And as h approaches 0 and g of x plus h is just g of x. So this just becomes f prime of x times g prime, or times g, plus f of x times g prime of x. And we're done. Okay, now we're going to do the quotient rule by the definition of derivative. So first thing we have to do is just write it out. So we've got f of x over g of x prime. Well, we're going to take the limit as h approaches 0. So now we're going to have to plug in both these functions with x plus h. We're going to have f of x plus h over g of x plus h, then minus f of x over g of x. And then remember, this whole thing is still all over h. Next step, we're just going to do a common denominator for the fractions in the top. So let's write her out. Limit as h approaches 0. We're going to write g of x on the right hand side. So we're going to start with f of x plus h times g of x minus f of x times g of x plus h. So all we did was put the g onto the f and the g of x plus h onto the minus f. Now that we have a common denominator, we can multiply the reciprocal of h. So we're just going to be ending up with an h on the bottom times g of x plus h times g of x. Great, groovy. Let's keep going. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take out this g of x plus h and g of x. We're going to separate this limit out a little bit. So we're going to take the limit as h approaches 0. We're going to write it as one whole thing. F of x plus h times g of x minus f of x times g of x plus h all over h. And now we're going to multiply by what we took out here. We've got the limit as h approaches 0 of 1 over g of x plus h times g of x. Okay. Now you can notice that in here, if h approaches 0, we just get g of x squared. So this right here just is equal to 1 over of g of x squared. Okay, that's a good start. Then we're going to add and subtract, just like we did in the product rule, but we're going to add and subtract f of x times g of x. So what happens when we do that? We get the limit as h approaches 0. We're going to start with this f of x plus h times g of x. We're going to minus f of x, g of x. Then we're going to add f of x, g of x. And then we're going to still have our minus f of x, g of x plus h. And that is there. And then this is still all over h. And we still have times 1 over g of x. Okay, great. Now again, we're going to group them. Have the limit as h approaches 0. We're going to take out of g of x in the first one. We're going to write it on the right hand side. So we're left with f of x plus h minus f of x. Then this, again, still all over h. Take out that g of x, so we're still got that g of x on the outside. Then we're going to take out a minus f of x. So minus f of x Now, since f of x is not dependent, I can write the limit on the inside here. So we've got the limit as h approaches 0. What do we have? If I take out a minus, we're going to have g of x plus h minus g of x all over h still. And we're going to still multiply by 1 over the g of x squared. Okay, looks pretty good so far. Next step, we realize that, again, this is just f prime. And this right here is g prime. So our final result is f prime of x times g of x minus f of x times g prime of x all over g of x quantity squared. And we're done. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Please hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.